Good afternoon, everybody. Today we've got a really exciting video, I think, because no matter what type of visa you're interested in, I think we've got something of interest here for everybody. And what am I referring to? We're going to rank all the major types of visa categories, starting from S, A, B, C, D, going down the list, and giving you our feedback as to what visas we think are most interesting, most reliable, which are not as reliable, which are a little bit more difficult, and put it in some kind of ranking order to maybe help you or get a better orientation as to what's available in the U.S. immigration system. Now, one caveat immediately I need to say is that this is going to be, differences and distinctions. And so the ranking I place doesn't necessarily mean this, if a visa is in the top, S tier, A tier, it doesn't mean necessarily it's going to be the best option for you. Again, we're doing this on a very generalized basis, just looking at kind of all the data. We've been doing this almost 20 years to give you kind of an understanding of what are the clearest, most direct ways of, achieving your goal of transitioning to the US. But again, a lot depends on the particulars of each individual person. Some people are more talented than others. Some people might have more money than others, and that would affect what would work best for you. So in any case, let's get started. We'll start with the top tier, the S tier. I think people that are younger than me know what this S tier stands for. When I was top, A was always the top tier, but I guess in these days with social media and everything, top tier is now S. So what would we say is the top tier of those top visas that allow our clients most directly and easily to get their result that they're looking for? I would say out of that top three tiers, and we could take a little bit from three different categories because, right, not everybody's super rich, not everybody's super talented, and not everybody has a close loved one who's here in the US. So why don't we start with that option first? If you're getting married to a US citizen, yes, it's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. That could be one of the best ways for you to try to get a green card in the US if you get married to a US citizen. Obviously, the problem is not everybody has a romantic partner who's a citizen, and if you don't, well, then this option just doesn't work for you. But if it does work for you and you do have that person, your better half is a US citizen, then of course, that's a very relatively fast and pain-free way to get a green card. And the advantage of going through citizenship also is that you're eligible for citizenship yourself after 3 years, not for 5 years for every other category. So if you get married to a citizen, you can file for your passport after 3 years. Every other green card category requires 5 years. So that's an added bonus of getting married to a citizen. Well, let's assume your love life is not as great as it otherwise should be, and that's not an option for you. What else could you consider? I would say probably next up is probably the EB-1A. EB-1A is a talent visa that provides a green card. So it's a straight direct path to a green card, has premium processing. You can get approved in 15 days. You don't have to have a job offer from a US company. So it makes life a lot easier than through labor perms and stuff. But there is a big but here, right? You need to be qualified. You need to have good talent, good achievements, demonstrable evidence to show that you are a leading, extraordinary individual in your area of expertise. And on that basis, you deserve a green card. So you can check out some of our videos about EB-1A to get more details. There's no set rule as to what you need to have, what achievements you have to be an EB-1A. It's so customized to each individual, what their background is and how things work. So, we've had IT specialists doing EB-1A. We've had athletes. We've had coaches of athletes. We've had, singers, business people, just managers, executives, serial entrepreneurs. And each one has its own challenges that we need to work with in order to prepare a strong case. But assuming you meet those general criteria, EB-1A is a relatively fast option. The next option in this S category in our top tier, I would say is EB-5. Now, right, you're going to say, well, Charles, yeah, if I had 800,000, maybe I'd never even, move to America. I'd, live a great life here in my home country. Yes, the $800,000 threshold is a challenge for people, but assuming you can meet that challenge, it's a very safe and reliable way to get a green card. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, unlike these other categories, there's no waiting time there's no retrogression, if you're Indian, Chinese, and other stuff like that. Well, citizenship through marriage, that's the exception. But if you're looking at EB-1A, for example, Indians, there's retrogression for them about 2 to 3 years, roughly. And depending on your nationality, there could be retrogression as well. With the EB-5, there's carve-outs, so that as of at least the time of this filming, there are no retrogression. There is no retrogression or lines for Chinese investors, Indian investors, Vietnamese, and whatnot. That probably will change in the future as more and more applicants from these countries apply. But as of this, time of the filming, spring 2026, there is no waiting time for people, investors from these various countries that often have retrogression. So that's a big, big plus if you're from one of these countries. If you're not from one of these countries, EB-5, why do I like it? Well, with the rural processing being in at 12 months right now, that's a pretty fast and decent processing time for an immigrant visa in the US. Okay, it's not as fast maybe as like a marriage petition, but again, not everybody's getting married to a US citizen. And it's not quite as fast, obviously, as EB-1A, as we just discussed. But nonetheless, if you're investing in a rural project, you're pretty certain you're gonna get an approval in about 12 months, and you do the adjustment of status process from there. Here's another good advantage of the EB-5. If you're even out of status, you have 180 days after you fall out of status to file your EB-5 and your adjustment of status application, and you can still stay in the US. So for example, let's say you were a tourist, you overstayed your time as a tourist. You're technically here illegally. As long as that illegal period does not exceed 180 days, you could still file your EB-5 here, do adjustment of status, not have to leave, get temporary work authorization, travel authorization without having to leave the US. So there are benefits with the EB-5 despite the high price tag. So let's go now down to the next tier, A tier of the top visa options that we believe exist. So as far as the A tier goes, let's start with the top A tier option. And I'll admit to you that this probably could be in the S tier, but the only reason it's not is because it doesn't lead to a green card. I'm talking about the E2 visa. If you've watched our videos, we love E2. We do lots of them. It's a great visa, honestly speaking. It's great. It's very reliable, very few denials depending on your country, but it's a great visa. The only reason I put it in the A tier and not the S tier is because it doesn't provide a green card. So you could be here for 20 years in an E2 status, and you're not one step closer to acquiring permanent residency. Now, if you're not shooting for permanent residency and you don't care, then I would say E2 is definitely top of the line there, S tier, if not even higher. But for only that reason, I put it in the A tier. Otherwise, in terms of approvability, requirements of clients, all these other things, it's top quality. The only other downside I would say of the E2 visa is that for your dependent children, once they turn 21, they can no longer be with the parents in the parents' E2 status. So the child would have to find some other status. They could technically file maybe their own E2 petition or some other visa status that will allow them to stay here there. That's the only reason why, or one of the only other reasons why I'd maybe put the E2, because once your kids turn 21, they're out of luck. They've got to find their own status. And once they turn 21, they can't even accompany you on your green card petition. So most clients who start with an E2 and they want to convert to a green card and they have children, you got to make sure you do that before your child turns 21. So what's the second option we have in our A tier? I would say an L1 visa. So L1 is very similar to an E2. A couple of the major differences are the following. First of all, L1 is not limited by any country, and you're eligible for an L1. So in one respect, that makes L1 more appealing. But I have to be honest with you, the requirements of an L1 are somewhat burdensome. First, you have to show that you have a qualifying company overseas that you've managed and controlled for at least the previous year. You also have to show you've got a new or existing company in the US. And if it is a new company in the US, within that first year, because they'll give you the L1 only for 1 year to start with, within that first year, you're going to have to hire at least 8 employees in the US, perhaps even more. That can be burdensome for a lot of small business owners. You don't have that requirement with E2s. You could have 1 or 2 employees for E2s. You could have 0. But with the L1, after that first year, you're going to have at least 8, probably better if you have 9 or 10 employees. And that's almost, the same amount of employees you need for EB-5. So at that point, some people might be saying, look, this is better to go with the EB-5. So for that reason, L1 is still of appeal. Like I said, there's no limits by country, by nationality, but there are quite a few burdens, especially in terms of hiring, that can cause it to be maybe not the first option for everybody else. Here's another thing I want to clarify about the L1. It is not an option for a green card, right? A lot of times people think, oh, I get an L1 and I can get a green card. You can convert from an L1 to a green card, and we'll talk about that visa in a second, but it's a separate process, it's a separate visa, and you don't need to necessarily start with the L1 to convert to the green card, but we'll get that in a few minutes. The third option I would say in this A tier is probably reunification, family reunification through a relative. So yeah, it's great. If your parents are here, if your child is a citizen, your child could invite you if you're the parents of the child. If you're a child of a US citizen, That could also work. But again, there are complications and there are long wait times depending on what category you're looking at. If your child is a U.S. citizen and you're the parent, it's very fast, straightforward, almost no wait time. Under a year, you can get it done. But there can be complications. If you are a U.S. citizen and let's say you want to sponsor your children, but your children are 21 or older, that's going to take a long time, depending what country you're from and whatnot, but it's a long time. You're looking at probably an average 10 years or longer. The same goes for any other familial relationship. So if you want to invite your brothers over, your sisters and stuff like that, again, if they're 21 or over, which is most often the case, you're looking at a decade or longer of waiting. So, family reunification is cheap. You don't have to make an $800,000 investment, for example, but with very few exceptions, the wait time can be quite lengthy. Let's talk now about the B tier. That's already coming down one more level. What would I place there? I would place other options that they're still viable options. I can't say things that bad about them, but they can be a little bit stickier. There's more moving parts that require clarification and collection of evidence and stuff like that that can be more difficult. So for this tier, I would put the NIW, National Interest Waiver. Sometimes people just call that the EB2, but you need to be careful. EB2, there's two types of EB2s. But if we're talking about EB2, National Interest Waiver, I would put this in that category. NIW is very similar in some ways to the EB1A, but historically, we've had much better approval rates with EB1A. The level of achievement that's required is higher, but from our experience, the criteria are more objective, and it's easier to estimate and make an evaluation of the client's likelihood of success with an EB1A than it is with an NIW. We've gotten decisions all over the place. NIW, some got approved that we thought were really weak, some that got denied that we thought were really strong. And a lot seems to be on the officer, and a lot depends on how you present the case. So even though NIW is super popular, I think it's been a victim of its own popularity. It has a retrogression period. There's a waiting time probably of about 2.5, 3 years as of the time of this filming. So even if you get premium processing, you get the approval in 45 days, you're still gonna have to wait probably 2 to 3 years just for your place in line. So that's another downside. But again, like I said, because of the subjective criteria and how it's applied by officers, I'm not a big fan of NIW. Another option in this tier is O1. So O1 is kind of the sister option of EB1A. Many of the criteria are almost identical, but just the level of achievement is lower than for the EB1. So the O1, again, level of achievement is lower, so more people theoretically would qualify. Maybe the only downside of the O1 is you need to have an employment offer. You theoretically could have your own company that hires you, but there's some nuances you have to take care of, so you'd have to discuss that with us. Most often you have an agent involved or another employer who's hiring you for a position that you're going to work in your area of expertise in the US. Again, that's not a huge hurdle to cross, but again, it could require finding a potential employer, somebody that's going to work with you and serve as that employer of record. The other problem I don't like about O1 is the main applicant can work for that employer. Spouse does not receive employment authorization, does not receive a social. So I think that's also a downside for a lot of people. Downside of the O1 is the fact that the initial period can be up to 3 years, but all the renewals are just for 1 year. So if you're renewing that E1 with the same employer, you can only do it for 1 year. So that gets a bit tedious for people that are looking to spend more than the initial 3 years with that same employer. The third option I would put in this tier is EB2, EB3 labor perm. So labor perm is you have to have an offer of employment from a company that is not controlled by you or your relatives, and that would allow you to get a green card. So great, no investments, you don't have to prove that you're super talented, all you have to do is prove that you're qualified for the job, and the employer can't find any qualified American applicants. So far, so good. Problems arise with the following. So let's say you have let's say your background, your education is in computer science, but the last 10 years you weren't working in computer science. Let's say you were working in sales, right? And you've been doing sales for the last 10 years. That may be a challenge, right? So, if you try to find a position that requires a background in computer science and some experience, you have a mismatch, right? You have the education, but not the experience. Or it could be vice versa. You might have the experience, but you don't have the requisite education for that position. So again, this is something that has to be worked out with the employer, and it sometimes can require, some workarounds. Other possible problems with the EB2, EB3, and probably the biggest problem I would say is the wait time. It is a long time, folks, right? So just to get the process approved, to get it through Department of Labor, the USCIS, all this stuff, that's probably taken at least 1.5 years, probably more like 2 years right now. And on top of that, because of the retrogression and the wait times on top of it, you're gonna have to wait another 2 to 3 years after that. So I mean, we're looking at a 4 to 5 year time horizon. I mean, that's a long time for people to wait. It's a long time for an employer to wait. And as you can imagine, most employers probably aren't even anticipating that you're gonna work for them after 4 or 5 years, or they're just gonna move on from waiting for you anyway. So that's another thing to keep in mind. But again, if the stars align and everything works well for you, and you can show that, hey, you've got the requisite education, experience, and you're willing to wait out those 4 or 5 years, and you cannot stay here those 4 or 5 years with concurrent filing for an adjustment of status. If you want to be here while you're waiting for your place in line, you've got to have some other visa, some other status that allows you to stay here all that time. So that can make it a challenging proposition for many people. At this point, folks, we're down to the C tier. We're down at the C level, and we're not scraping the bottom of the barrel, but we're getting there. So in the C tier, I would put the H-1B visa. Why would I do that? Well, first of all, thanks to President Trump, there's that $100,000 surcharge for anybody applying outside the US. Obviously, that's going to put a huge dampener on any applicants outside the US. Other problem, which has always been a problem, is it's a lottery system. You never know if you're going to get picked or not. Historically, in the past, maybe 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people got selected. We'll see with this $100,000 tax. I'm sure there's going to be less applicants. How good your chances are going to improve, I can't say, but we'll find out later this year in 2026. But I would say for those 2 reasons alone, H-1B is just not that appealing as it used to be. And so that's why we put it in the C tier of our ranking. The other visa I'd put there is a F1, student visa. Now there's no knock here against students. I mean, we love students and they should come here to study. But what I'm looking at this is from an immigration perspective. So a lot of times people use an F1 as a stepping stone to a more long-term viable visa status or green card. But there are problems, right, with the F1. So first of all, if you're applying for the F1 visa at your embassy, depending upon your ethnicity or your nationality, your background, how many times you've been to the US, how much time you've spent here, you could have serious problems getting the F1 visa at the embassy. They tend not to like people that are over college age, right? So if you're 30, 35, 40, and you're gonna go to the consular officer saying, hey, I wanna go to America and study, even if it's totally legit, you're going to get a master's degree, an executive degree, something like that. They're very skeptical about older people, above 25, maybe 30. They're very skeptical at the embassies about people getting F1 visas. Now, if you come here as a tourist, you can change your status in the US to the F1 status. With that, there's much more flexibility. Although we've noticed with the Trump administration, they're challenging these changes of status more than they have in the past. They're saying, why are you staying here? Why are you enrolling in English language school? Why can't you study English back in your home country? We've, for the most part, maybe completely, in all cases, we've been successful in overcoming these challenges from CIS, but we can see the trend is very obvious. And for that reason, F1 is becoming a little bit more difficult. And even if you can receive the F1 status here, which, like I said, generally for the most part, you can do that without big problems, you really can't leave the US, because if you leave the US, you're going to have to get the F1 visa. And like I said, that's going to be really tough to get, especially if you've got the status here. And especially if you're going to like a language school or something that's not an accredited degree program. They're very skeptical at the embassy about these kind of English, classes and stuff like that. So you really can't leave the US. You can't work. Neither you nor your spouse can work. So it's really a transitionary visa. And again, it can serve its purpose as a transition, as a stepping stone. But in terms of being a long-term solution, it's not really any of those. Next is the D tier. Now, D is in, it's not quite the F. We'll get to that in a minute. But D, the only option we would put there is probably asylum, political asylum. Trust me, for some people who've been, harassed, tormented, abused in their home country, yes, asylum is a very legitimate option. But from my experience, that is not the case for the vast majority of people applying for asylum. From what I've seen, and this is part of the reason we don't really deal with asylum, is in most cases, it's just people that are trying to stay here temporarily while they're working out a more long-range, long-term option that works for them. Because asylum, the line is so long, the criteria is becoming stiffer and stiffer. Trump's administration is clamping down on, I don't want to say fraudulent, but frivolous, should we say, asylum claims. And the problem is, once you file for asylum, you could be blocking off other options for yourself, or you're certainly going to make it much more difficult for you later to transition to a different option. So that's why you don't want to go into this willy-nilly and just file for something thinking, okay, we'll see how it turns out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Because if you go in without a strategy, and once you file for asylum, first of all, you're going to close your options for any non-immigrant visas. So an E2, you might be a perfect candidate for an E2, but if it doesn't work out, your asylum claim doesn't work out and you say, hey, let's try an E2. Once you file for asylum and show that you have immigrant intent, you can pretty much forget about applying for any non-immigrant visa or status. So, E2 is off the board. O1 is likely taken off the table as well. And so you're limiting your options. And even if you're going to look at filing an immigrant option, for a green card, maybe an EB2, EB3, there are severe limitations that would be placed on you as a result of that asylum petition. So only consider asylum if you really have no other options. Finally, at the bottom of the tier, we got the F class, right? So we know what F stands for, whether it's school or social media rankings, F is an F. There's no visa per se. We gave an F grade to, but maybe we should, but we're generous graders. But what we would qualify as F is just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing if it sticks. You don't want, like I just mentioned with asylum, you don't want to file something just to file it without having a clear plan what you're going to do and what are the consequences of what you do. Because any decision you make with your future in the US, any immigration decision, even if it's a temporary one, you're filing for an F1, you're filing for asylum, there are ramifications of that. And you don't want to unnecessarily foreclose any options you might have in the future, because if option A or plan A doesn't work out, what's plan B and what's plan C? And if by choosing a bad plan A, you're closing the doors on plan B and plan C, you're just going to make, unfortunately, things more difficult for yourself and your family to make that long-term transition here to the US. So what I would put in the F tier is just doing something because you're desperate to do something. Don't do that. If that's what your attorney's advising you, maybe get a second or third opinion about what the consequences are, what are all the options, and what could be the negative consequences if things don't work out, so you can ensure that you still have a viable path to the US. Hopefully this ranking was helpful to you. I think it was, because it gives you a general overview of what exists out there. Again, like I said, everybody's different, and we don't want to give overly broad advice when we in fact need to look at your options and put together an efficient and effective plan to make your transition to the US. Again, I'm Charles Raether. Look forward to seeing you in the near future.